Hello and welcome to this first of these supplementary city profiles that we'll be doing for the GI class this semester, partly in response to the university closure and the coronavirus outbreak, and partly to give you some additional information or pointers in terms of how you might use different case studies in your work for your first assessment or for the whatever form the second assessment takes. Now, what we'll be looking at in these city profiles is how cities in the UK and internationally are thinking about green infrastructure from a number of different perspectives. So partly this will look at different scales and different sizes of GI, what these GI resources are delivering, whether they actually are located within a single location, or whether they're actually sort of multi-scalar and work at a number of different scales. We'll also talk a little bit about the economy, the socio-cultural and the political sort of aspects of developing GI, so nothing that we haven't really covered in class. And then we'll talk a little bit about, for each of the examples, of the way in which climate change or access, different users and the benefits they derive from GI, and potentially things like water, might have an impact on what's going on. And you should use these as a starting point to think about what sort of examples or case studies, what sort of policies, what sort of stakeholders might be involved in terms of your understanding of GI use in different places, and how those things might influence the way in which we either construct, develop, manage, design, or even value GI. And we're going to start close to home with this first one, and we're going to start in Manchester. So Manchester as a city has an industrial heritage, and therefore has quite a lot of reflection in this in terms of the waterways, so the Irwell, the Medlock, and the way in which the city is structured around certain connective paths. But if we look at the spatial footprint of the city, particularly Manchester itself, that very long narrow strip running from the city centre down towards the airport, there is a much smaller proportion of GI than in other parts of Greater Manchester, be it somewhere like Rochdale or Oldham. And partly this reflects the very urban and dense urban core that Manchester has compared to some of the other local authorities, but also it reflects the way in which we as we build outwards, we start to build more expansively in suburban areas, and there's more space for GI. And so the fact that Manchester as a city, and particularly Manchester city centre, is in many cases retrofitting or slotting in GI where there are gaps in the landscape is quite important. And again, just a few examples here. One from outside home, so First Street, one of one of the canals, and around the back of Victoria, and all are making use of certain elements of GI to make it more interactive, to make it more connected, to maybe think about the aesthetic qualities of these things, and potentially about how it might respond to climate change. So one thing to think about in Manchester in particular is the ways in which the city is looking to invest in GI. It is a leader in natural capital accounting, in GI thinking, in ecosystem services, and be that through the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework or the work being led by the Greater Manchester Climate Authority. But what we do see is variation in the way that each of these different plans, each of these different strategies maps onto what's actually happening on the ground. So the conversation is always about Manchester city centre having a lack of green space, a lack of accessible areas, and where it does have places such as Piccadilly Gardens, we might not wish to visit them because of the way in which they are designed, or which they're located, or the people who actually use them. So we have to think quite carefully about what's actually there, how we might use them, what benefits we might get. So the middle picture outside Pizza Express and outside home might be useful for having a nice afternoon drink, or maybe going and meeting your friends, but not necessarily in terms of water management or flood mitigation. The canal there is very good for connectivity, but maybe falls down in terms of safety and fears of safety, and the way in which it promotes biodiversity. And the picture on the left is from just beside Victoria and the cathedral, and a little urban beach. It might seem very out of place, but people do use that location. So we have to think about how these individual little places build up into a network, and how they might provide functions across the city. And again, there are other areas where we can think about how GI can be invested in as those small or intimate places, or things that are much wider or have a more significant impact. So the redevelopment of St Peter's Square as a transport hub, as a location for economic prosperity, with the council, with the library, and then the new businesses on the left hand side of this picture. There's not a need there, or there's not a desire for an expanse of green space. But the fact that there are green space, there are water features, there are trees there, means that the landscaping does offer something in terms of an aesthetic quality, but also in terms of why you might want to spend time there. It's not just a cut through, although that's what many people use it for. It actually is a location where people might want to spend some time. So there's an added value of integrating GI into such places. The middle picture is around the back of one of the Vita student halls, just near the Factory nightclub and near the Lascari pub, and it's a little public, semi-public private garden which actually has a gate on one side to mean that people may feel that they're excluded, but it's designed to have a little bit more of a natural feel, so the grass isn't kept quite as short. The grass coming through the paving is quite interesting, and it sort of maps onto the very new shiny Vita building, but also the traditional sort of warehouse factory buildings on the right hand side. And so you've got this little cut through, this little almost an oasis in the centre of the city, which is predominantly quite quiet, even though it's quite near the railway lines, but it's not very well used because of the big gate at the far end of this image, but also because a lot of the students spend time inside there. So it's probably not being maximised to its fullest potential, but could be in the future. And finally, the picture on the right there is from Sale Water Park, a big sort of urban fringe area just next to the motorway, where you've got a big lake and some countryside walks. It links into the city through the canal paths and has a number of different things that you can do there for different families. It also is part of the flood mitigation, has quite biodiverse areas, and it has areas that back onto agricultural fields. But one of the problems with this is that it is quite difficult to get to. You have to either drive there or go on the tram predominantly, so its use might be curtailed by being not necessarily as accessible as other places. So again, across Manchester we can see areas that are quite big and quite important in terms of their value as green spaces, Heaton Park in North Manchester being one example, but also a lot of areas where the perceived level of GI might be quite small because they're working around a quite dense urban area. So in terms of how we think about GI, is it about the size, is it about the scale of the investment, or is it about the benefit and the function that we derive from it? And again, if we're thinking in policy terms, how does the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework map onto the Manchester City Plan and then to more local neighbourhood sort of objectives? So lots to think about there. And this will just be the first of a number of these little city profiles, but if you have any questions, please do ask. Okay, thank you.